Hi, this is Congressman Tom Cole. This is another one of our congressional weekly chats. We're going to cover quite a bit of ground today because it's been a couple weeks since we've done it and Congress has been incredibly busy. But let me begin with something that's not up here, and that's a recent trip I took. I'm going to talk to you about that. But before I do, we're actually broadcasting from the chairman's office in the Rules Committee. One of my new assignments in this new Congress is as the chairman of the Rules Committee. I'm the first Oklahoman to ever chair the Rules Committee in the House, and I think the first Native American as well. But it's a pretty extraordinary committee. It's the only committee that actually meets in the Capitol building. It's the oldest committee. Obviously, when Congress was formed, the first thing it did was have to write the rules it would operate by. And the Rules Committee applies those rules and makes exceptions to them. Every major piece of legislation comes through the Rules Committee. The office here is really one of the little jewels in the Capitol building. We're immediately next to the hearing room, which is a small, very intimate hearing room. As a rule, only members testify there, not exclusively, but usually. And they're coming to testify about legislation or amendments that they want brought to the floor or that they might oppose. So it's the busiest committee in Congress as well. It literally meets more often than any other committee, more hours there. The majority party commands the committee. It's a 9-4 committee. It doesn't matter what the ratio is. The Speaker appoints the 9 members in the majority. Obviously, Speaker McCarthy made me chairman. I've been the ranking member, the top Republican for the 4 previous years in the minority. And the Democratic leader appoints all the Democrats. So honestly, you've got people that broadly reflect and share the views and values of the majority in their respective conferences. And they usually work very closely with leadership and conference committee chairs and ranking members to develop the arguments and shape the legislation that's going to go to the House, usually the next day or over the course of the next week. So it's a great committee to be privileged to head, and one that puts you at the center of the action, so to speak. But as I said, I want to begin not talking about Congress, but something that happened a couple of weeks ago. And we didn't announce it before it happened. We talked about it afterwards for security reasons. I was part of a very senior delegation of defense appropriators. These are the people that actually decide how much money we're going to spend on defense and what accounts it's going to go to. The chairman of that committee is a very close friend of mine named Ken Calvert from California, and he asked myself and several others to go with him to the Far East and look at the emerging situation in the Western Pacific. So we visited Japan, and as well as Japan proper, also Okinawa, where the United States has extensive military facilities. From there we went to Taiwan, which of course we all recognize as part of China, but also as not under Chinese communist control. And it's never been settled whether it would be, how it will be governed long term. That's something we think should be negotiated. Then we went from there to South Korea, which always a flashpoint where we have again, large military presence. And we actually had the North Koreans testing missiles during the time we were actually in the air flying into South Korea. So that's a pretty sobering thing to think about. I will tell you that everybody in that part of the world, I've been particularly to Japan quite a bit in my congressional career, is focused in a way I've never seen before on national security. Concern over Chinese saber rattling in the Western Pacific is great. As a matter of fact, while we were there, just before we were there, Japan, historically, since World War II, a country that is almost pacifist, announced that they were going to double their defense budget from 1% to 2% of their gross national product over the next 5 years. That's an extraordinary thing. The Japanese economy is the 3rd largest economy in the world, after ourselves in China. So for them to be doing that will be a big addition to the strength of our allies. Taiwan, which is feeling the pressure of China, also is not only expanding its defense budget, they still have conscription there. It was pretty token until recently. That is, you only had to serve 4 months. That's been increased to a year. And they're a country of 23 million that's being threatened by a country of 1.3 billion. So they're extraordinarily concerned. And of course, South Korea has a very robust defense industry and presence of its own. Many hundreds of thousands of people in their military. They are very supportive of us. They actually paid for the base areas where most of our military are, and these are investments of 10 and 12 billion dollars. So the discussion was how to react if China decides to move in the Western Pacific and retake Taiwan. That would be no easy, exercise for the Chinese. There's 100-mile strait to get through, but they have other options as well. They could blockade the island. Taiwan imports 70% of its food. It only has enough food on the island to sustain itself for about 30 days, only about enough energy, because most of that's imported as well, to sustain itself for 10 days to 2 weeks at top consumption. So it has a lot of vulnerabilities, but it has a very determined population, purchases a lot of weapons from the United States, and actually wants to buy more. By the way, the same thing is true of Japan, which is placing major orders for weapons with the United States. And of course, South Korea and American forces are almost interoperable. We fought the Korean War together. We've maintained a strong military presence there since the 1950s. And again, they're a very strong ally. And it's interesting to see, these are countries that historically don't always trust one another, particularly the Koreans, South Koreans, and the Japanese have historically been at odds. But while we were in the region, the South Korean president was actually visiting Japan in a very unprecedented visit to discuss the common threats that they face from China. So I would just say this, everybody in the region is watching Ukraine very carefully. You say, well, why would they be doing that? As a matter of fact, during our time there, the Japanese Prime Minister was visiting Ukraine, and they've been very supportive of the Ukrainian effort. But they all think in the region, if the Russians are successful in Ukraine, that the Chinese are much more likely to try and do something militarily in the Western Pacific. We visited at length with our units on Okinawa. We have 6 Marine bases on a relatively small island, plus a major Air Force base. They're being redeployed around the island. It's actually the largest concentration of Marines any place in the world is actually in Okinawa. So we're very forward deployed there, and the aim is to try and deter any aggression, to discourage it from happening. And our job was to see what we could do to both strengthen our alliances and make sure that the men and women that we served out there, and there are actually more Americans stationed in Japan than any other place in the world outside the continent, outside the United States itself, have whatever they need to successfully discharge their missions and keep the peace in the Western Pacific. So it's a pretty sobering trip, but one that needed to be made, and I was very proud to be part of it. Here in Congress, the spring usually coincides with an increase of activity, and we're seeing a lot of that. Last week, the Congress passed, or the House passed, the Parental Bill of Rights. That's a very important piece of legislation. It simply ensures that parents have the final say in all things related to their children, particularly with respect to their education. And so we laid out a number of things, that parents have a right to know what the curriculum is. Parents have a right to know if there are any violence problems in the school. Parents have the right to know if there's been a case of sexual impropriety in the school. We had a case in Virginia recently where literally a student was raped in a bathroom by a transgender individual, and the father showed up to complain about that at a school board meeting, and he was arrested for being disorderly because he was pretty upset, and you can understand why. So this is to lay out the decision-making authority that parents have and the access that schools need to provide, and the transparency to what the environment the child is, and again, the impact that parents should have on curriculum and things of that nature. We were proud to pass that. We'll see what happens in the United States Senate. Probably be pretty tough because most Democrats oppose the legislation, unfortunately, although a few voted with us. This week, we dealt with an equally controversial area. This was H.R. 1, or House Resolution 1, and it was on energy production. There's no question the Biden administration has been extraordinarily hostile to fossil fuels. One of the president's first actions was to cancel the Keystone pipeline. He also suspended drilling and exploration for fossil fuel on federal lands. There's been a slew of legislation that makes it more difficult to produce fossil fuels, although even the administration, once gas prices started going up, started backing off a little bit and saying, well, they did expect there would be a need for oil and gas for the next 10 years. I would say they're probably off by at least 90 years. So this was a pushback, an effort to make sure that America becomes energy independent again, that we have a robust infrastructure here. There's also those supportive of other types of energy. Oklahoma is a pretty good example. Almost half of our electricity now is provided by wind in Oklahoma. So it's not a hostility to green or renewable sources of energy, but the reality is we need an all of the above energy plan. The Biden administration has been enormously hostile to the fossil fuel industry, even things like natural gas that actually lower the carbon content and that lowered the greenhouse gas emissions. Those are things we ought to be working on. Again, if we can find other things that are more efficient, effective, and cleaner, that's fine. But you don't throw away the energy you need in pursuit of more expensive and sometimes more difficult to implement solutions. Right now, we need an abundance of energy. Our allies in Europe who've been, targeted by the Russians need independent sources of energy. The president seems to think we can get those from Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, Venezuela. Some of those countries are our friends, some are not. We would rather produce the energy we need for America in America, and if we need to buy something else, then we certainly will, but let's use the resources we have. So that's what the debate was about. I was very pleased that legislation passed today. Again, we've got a Democratic Senate. It's probably not going to be as supportive as we would like, but at least there's legislation out there that is common sense, that will benefit the average American consumer and move toward making us energy independent. This is also a time of year where we get quite a bit of traffic coming into DC from people that are coming to talk to their legislators about a whole variety of issues, both the issues I just discussed, but usually appropriations. And of course, as an appropriator, somebody as a senior member, I'm the vice chair of the Appropriations Committee and chair one of the larger subcommittees, Transportation, Housing, and Urban Development. We see a lot of people coming in, and we certainly have a lot of Oklahomans. In this very office, had an opportunity to visit last week with President Joe Harris, the University of Oklahoma. They have, of course, a range of things that they need in terms of research grants, facilities, things like that. We're obviously trying to work hand in glove with the university to see that their needs are met. That benefits not just them, but the entire state of Oklahoma, because University of Oklahoma and Oklahoma State are both research institutions that contribute to the progress of the entire state. We try to work closely with both of them, obviously particularly OU since it's in the district. We also had the Farm Bureau here. They're beginning their campaign for the Farm Bill, and again, to educate our members about what the needs are for rural Oklahoma. And then we get quite a few of the chambers that come in. They haven't all come yet, but the Norman Chamber has. They always come, but we usually see the Oklahoma City Chamber, the Lawton Chamber, and of course the Chamber of Commerce for the state of Oklahoma. And they bring an enormous number of Oklahomans up here to educate us about the issues, testify before Congress, and again advance the interests of our state. Last thing that's going on, of course, is the appropriations activity is picking up. Again, I sat on the Defense Appropriations Subcommittee. It's been meeting literally twice a day, several times a week. In the last couple of weeks, the effort being to get a bill ready for June, July timeline. I also have been chairing, again, the Transportation HUD and Urban Development Subcommittee. We, matter of fact, had a hearing today. This is Thursday, and on what's called member initiatives, where different members of Congress come in, talk about what's important to their district. We've also had meetings with the Inspector Generals, or hearings, both Housing and Urban Development and Department of Transportation, on how we can be more efficient in spending the dollars, more transparent, what safeguards they think we need to make sure that money is spent as Congress and the American people intend it to be spent. And then we'll be having in a couple of weeks the two secretaries, Secretary Fudge for Housing and Urban Development. She's actually an old colleague of mine. She's a former member of Congress, very highly respected, and Secretary Buttigieg, who will be coming in to talk to us at the Department of Transportation. And he's somebody I've had the opportunity to meet and interact with. He was actually this week in Oklahoma visiting the Federal Aeronautical Agency in Oklahoma City. That's the largest concentration of Department of Transportation employees outside of Washington, D.C., any place in the world. Do critical work there. And he also made a quick tour of the Will Rogers Airport, and that was part of a series of airports he was visiting to look at what their needs are. So again, those are places that we interact with on a regular basis, and they will have requests and needs in the transportation bill that's coming up later this year. So again, I would just say Congress is in that very, very busy stage. Not surprisingly, there's conflict. There was conflict over the Parental Bill of Rights. There's conflict over H.R. 1, the energy bill. I would expect there to be differences of opinion on appropriations bills. But that's how our system works. And hopefully we can work through those conflicts, find a common ground, and make some arrangements and some deals that benefit the American people without doing what the last majority did, and that's spend so much money that we cause an inflationary outburst. But again, those discussions will be for another day. But again, just want you to know Congress is hard at work. We'll know later in the year how effective that work is, but no question that the work's getting done right now. So look forward to visiting with you sometime in the next few weeks. The next 2 weeks, we're actually in our district on district work period, so I'll be traveling around quite a bit over the district and interacting with businesses, farms, ranches, obviously our great military bases and military personnel, and again, getting a better understanding of the district and its needs, but also answering the questions that constituents have about what's actually happening in Washington, what are the chances of getting something done. So Hope to talk to you again. We may well do one of these things before we get back to DC, but again, just keep tuning in because this will be a very regular feature going forward. So good luck, God bless, look forward to visiting with you again soon.